So welcome to the culture today for another video where we're going to be discussing joint stability and the factors that influence a joint to either be more stable or more mobile from its inherent characteristics. I think stability as a whole is a bit of a misunderstood term in strength and conditioning, particularly from young coaches and also obviously clients and athletes who don't have a strong theoretical understanding of anatomy. So that's what we're going to try and break down today. What are the factors, or what are the anatomical factors that influence a joint's stability? The first thing that we have to understand is that stability and mobility occur on a continuum. And in order to have a stable joint, it means that we must remove its mobility or its ability to move freely. And vice versa, if you want a mobile joint, it inherently means that we have lost the stability of that joint. So I like to think of this as a continuum of movement, and depending on these three factors, osseous restraints, passive restraints, and active restraints, it will depend on, the joint will then sit somewhere on this continuum. It's pretty well understood that the body has mobile or joints that are closer to the mobile end, and then we also have more stable joints. A typical example of this would be the thoracic spine compared to the lumbar spine. The thoracic spine is built for mobility. We can have a whole lot more range of rotation, flexion and extension when compared to the lumbar spine, which has larger vertebra and more surface area of the discs, meaning that it's a little bit more of a stable joint when compared to the thoracic spine. So that would be an example of how different joints will fit on this continuum differently. The three factors that influence a joint's stability is the osseous formation of the bones themselves, the passive restraints, so the structures that aren't influenced by the central nervous system, and then you also have the active restraints and all of the muscles, tendons, that are connected to the bones and are influenced by the central nervous system. The osseous formation of bones is literally just the structure in which the joint is made. We know that hinge joints like the elbow and the knee prefer to only move in one range of motion or one plane of motion, flexion and extension, and that is largely because of how the bones are actually formed. When we look at the knee, we have two epicondyles, so two big bulbous parts at the bottom of the femur, and that connects very well with the end plane or the tibial plateau of the tibia, the top of the tibia. And those two formations, or the formation of that joint and how they articulate, pretty much only allow flexion and extension. Yes, we have small degrees of range of motion in rotation and frontal plane, so abduction, adduction, but for the most part, the only available plane of motion of the knee is flexion and extension. So that would be an example of how the osseous formation would affect how much range of motion or how mobile the joint is. Secondary to that, we have passive restraints, and these are the restraints that aren't influenced by the central nervous system. I've written a list here. We have the ligaments, the labrums, the menisci, the neural pathways or the nerves. They do offer stability, particularly at some of the smaller joints. The vascular system, and then also the skin, because the skin does house a lot of that stability and hold everything in nice and tight. So these passive restraints are not influenced by the central nervous system, which pretty much means us as strength and conditioning coaches or your coach as an athlete cannot really affect the stability by either of these first two factors. So the osseous formation is obviously purely genetic, and then also your passive restraints is also purely genetic. A surgeon can go in and change the bone formation. A good example of this would be a femoral acetabular impingement, or like a cam impingement or a cam lesion, where the femoral head has started to develop some bony landmarks or some bony protrusions, and a surgeon could go in and grind that down to make a little bit more of a mobile joint so that we're not colliding with the acetabular lip. That would be an example of increasing mobility. So we're moving away from stability, increasing mobility through surgery and affecting the osseous formation of the bones. Same thing could happen with a passive restraint. A surgeon could go in and fix an ACL, and that would then obviously move the joint to a more stable end of the spectrum, and we're closing down some of that frontal or transverse plane range of motion at the knee. So that would be osseous and passive restraints, purely dependent on genetics and the formation of your body. The final factor would be active restraints, and this is where us as strength and conditioning coaches have the biggest influence on all of our clients and our athletes and their joints themselves. This is purely dependent from the central nervous system's input into the muscles and the tendons. Obviously, strengthening muscles over time, we are inherently increasing that stability of the joint. We're moving away from mobility over time, and we're stabilizing the joint through active stability of the muscles and tendons. If we wanted to look at something like the functional range conditioning or FRCs, what we're trying to do with that is we're trying to increase central nervous system input into end ranges of motion, and as a result, we are trying to increase the mobility of that joint. So we're trying to access and have control in greater ranges of end range of motion at all joints. So it's a really great way for a coach to mobilize a joint and increase mobility actively and control those new ranges of motion. So just to recap, all joints live on a continuum of stability and mobility, and the inherent structures of those joints, the passive restraints of osseous formation and the passive restraints of the ligaments, labrums, menisci, neural and vascular systems, and the skin offer a certain amount of stability for that joint. As coaches, in any capacity, the only real way that we have influence on affecting the stability or the mobility of a joint is through the active restraint, of muscles, tendons, and the central nervous system input into those two. If you have any questions, drop in the comment section below. As always, like and subscribe for fresh content. If you're not following our Instagram, I highly recommend getting on there. We've been dropping a lot of content on Instagram lately. As always, we'll see you next time, and happy lifting. I woke up early this morning. I don't